Hi, I'm Mark Galitko. I'm now a professor in the anthropology department at University of Notre Dame. But for 5 years before that, from 2010 to 2015, I was a postdoctoral researcher here at the Field Museum, working with the Pacific collection, specifically things from New Guinea, and also doing field work in Papua New Guinea. From 2010 till 2015, I was a postdoctoral researcher here. And for part of that, I was the Regenstein postdoc, so basically I was just doing Pacific-related research, both on collections and field work in New Guinea. So this project's being done as part of an internship between Notre Dame and the Field Museum. So the two institutions have had a connection for a number of years. We used to have interns that worked here from Notre Dame for many years. Then the program kind of lapsed, so this year we're sort of trying to restart it. With really the focus on it being sort of a research internship, where a student from Notre Dame comes here to the Field Museum and gets a lot of museum experience, but specifically understanding how museum collections can be used in scientific and anthropological research.
So I'm Clay Jaskowski. I'm a student at Notre Dame, undergraduate student at Notre Dame in the anthropology department, and I'm working here at the Field Museum over the summer with the joint internship between the Field Museum and the university, working on research under the Regenstein Pacific collections. So interning at the Field Museum has been a really great experience for me because coming in, I really had no experience in the field or with any like hands-on anthropological things or like objects, or I didn't have much experience at all, but being here has been really great, helping out in the collections. I've been able to see different artifacts, work very closely with the daggers and soon with the spears as well. And I've been able to learn a lot more about the pXRF and how we're collecting data from these different objects. And even a couple weeks ago, a researcher came in from the university in Toronto, and he was doing pXRF on some human remains. And being able to work with these different researchers shows me like a much broader application of these methods that we use. And it's been really great to get experience with this and see a broad anthropological, have a broad anthropological experience while also doing specific research on our project.
So the Dagger project, these come from the Admiralty Islands, which are an island group to the north of mainland New Guinea. They're pretty much right on the equator. And they're a place that was studied anthropologically by Margaret Mead, who's a very famous ethnographer, in the early 1930s, along with her then husband, Rio Fortune. And she describes a lot about the sort of economic and social lives of the people living there. And those kind of, like, what she found there has basically been used as sort of a model in Pacific archaeology for understanding sort of prehistoric trade patterns, let's say, and how people are linked to one another across different island groups. But we know very little about how long that sort of pattern is held. By the time Mead was studying there in the 1930s, the Admiralty Islands had already been in contact with Europeans and been colonized, in fact, for several decades. So they were first visited by Europeans in the 1870s, and by 1930 it was part of German New Guinea, and it had a long history of sort of interacting with museums, colonial companies, and so on. So, you know, there's this thought that that might have changed a lot about how people were actually making things, interacting with one another, and so far, and so on. So the idea is to basically figure out where the materials that the daggers are made came from, and that's, we're using chemistry basically in comparison to things like the actual shape of the blades and the decorative motifs on them, to try and pin down where exactly in the Admiralty group the daggers came from, and the spears, which we will be doing in a couple of weeks as well. So basically the tip of the daggers, look at one here, is made out of obsidian, which is volcanic glass, so it forms when volcanoes erupt if the lava cools really quickly. It's extremely sharp. It's also a fairly attractive material. It's kind of opaque black, shiny. And so wherever it was available, people liked to make stone tools out of it. So the good thing about obsidian is that it also, each time that a volcano erupts and produces obsidian, it's really chemically different from other sources of obsidian. So if you measure the chemistry, you can basically tie it back to where it came from. So we can do this with archaeological materials, or we can do it with ethnographic materials like this. So basically the museum has a number of sets of daggers and spears that were collected and produced in different time periods, dating back to I think 1884, going all the way up to the early 1980s. So one goal is to sort of look at those materials, where they're coming from, and whether that changes during that time in response to things like museum collecting, the tourist industry, and so on. And see basically whether the pattern that Meade observed in 1930 really reflects what was going on even, let's say, 50 years earlier. And if it's very different, that tells us something about the fact that what Meade observed may not be terribly representative of what was going on there in the pre-colonial era, or well back into the past. So these actual blades, they've been making these in the Admiralties for about 6,000 years. And it's a very long, developing but continuous tradition of producing things like this. So understanding something about how much change we can see in the recent past can tell us a little bit about how accurate those ethnographic models are for understanding what happened, centuries ago or even thousands of years ago.